The story begins with an emotionally gripping scene, one that is not easy to forget, a mother's heart-wrenching cry as her child is torn away from her. In the late 19th century, in the vast, unforgiving terrain of the Congo Free State, such scenes were disturbingly common. The camera lingers on an aged, weathered letter, a primary source, handwritten, fragile with age. It is a letter written by an African mother to an unknown recipient, a letter filled with both pain and despair, telling the story of how Belgian forces separated her from her child. As the narrator reads the letter aloud, the emotional weight of the words carries the audience into the depths of human suffering. The letter begins with a brief introduction of the mother's life before the event, describing a time of relative peace in the village, though it hints at the larger oppressive forces of colonialism at play, forces that had not yet fully revealed their cruelty. The mother speaks of her child, her pride, her world, her future, who was suddenly ripped away, taken by soldiers who had come to the village with promises of reform and order. Her words describe the terror of that moment, the confusion in her child's eyes as they were both forcefully separated, the harshness of the soldiers, and the brutal indifference with which they treated the lives of innocent families. The scene transitions to a description of the Belgian colonial presence in the Congo, led by King Leopold II, whose personal control over the vast region had turned it into one of the most brutally exploited places on earth. King Leopold, obsessed with wealth and power, had made the Congo Free State his personal possession, and under his rule, horrific abuses became widespread. The audience is led to understand that the taking of children was not just an isolated tragedy but a systematic part of a larger colonial machine. Belgian authorities, driven by an insatiable need for rubber and ivory, used violence, fear, and coercion to break the will of the local populations. In the next transition, the narrative zooms out from the personal horror of the mother's story, taking a broader look at the social and political landscape of the Congo during the late 1800s. The massive exploitation of both people and land under King Leopold's rule was disguised as a civilizing mission, sold to the world as a noble cause. But the reality was far darker. The very idea of civilization was turned on its head in the Congo, where the brutality of the Belgian regime was masked by the superficial presence of missionary activities and European reformers. Behind the carefully crafted facade, Belgian officials were extracting the very lifeblood from the Congolese people, rubber, ivory, and the most precious resource of all, the labor of the indigenous population. Yet the European world turned a blind eye, and the atrocities continued in the shadows. The mother's letter, now read to its final lines, paints a picture of absolute helplessness. The separation from her child, the devastation she felt, was part of a larger, horrifying pattern. Women and children were deliberately taken from their families by the Belgian authorities. The aim was clear: break the spirit of the people, force them into submission, and ultimately increase productivity for the rubber trade. If the fathers didn't meet their rubber quotas, the women and children were held hostage as human collateral. The mother's anguish becomes a symbol for all those who suffered, whose stories were buried in the vast darkness of colonial oppression. The emotional weight of this revelation is undeniable. The camera zooms in on the hand of the letter's writer, trembling as she speaks of the unbearable pain of knowing her child might never be returned. The cruel choices forced upon her, and countless other mothers, take on a life of their own. The question lingers: why did the Belgians focus their cruelty on the families? What was the logic behind their decision to take the children? The narrative then shifts from the letter to archival photos and illustrations of the Congo Free State, showing the horrifying scenes of rubber collection. The images, although faded, show groups of men, women, and children working under the whip of Belgian soldiers, with little regard for human life. There are pictures of Belgian officers, stern and cold, standing next to their African workers, who appear gaunt, hollow-eyed, and broken. These images drive home the brutality of the colonial regime in a way that words cannot fully express. As the letter's story unfolds, the audience begins to grasp the magnitude of the human toll that colonialism in the Congo exacted, a toll paid in blood, sweat, and the tears of mothers who saw their children taken away from them, never to be returned. The emotional devastation faced by the victims becomes personal, and viewers are left grappling with the stark realization that the atrocities described were just the tip of the iceberg. Through the lens of this letter, the broader tragedy of the Belgian occupation begins to take shape. The forced abductions were only one aspect of a much larger and more complex system of exploitation. Rubber extraction, often referred to as the blood rubber trade, was the driving force behind the violence. But the violence was not just physical. It was psychological. It was about breaking the spirit of the people, making them believe that their very existence was secondary to the needs of the Belgian state. The letter ends on a sorrowful note, and the camera pulls away from the page, revealing the woman's face in the present day, a woman who has lived through the legacy of those events. A descendant, perhaps, of the very mother who penned this letter. The anguish is still visible in her eyes, passed down through generations, as though the horrors of the past are still fresh. The audience feels the emotional weight of that history, sensing that the ripples of colonial brutality continue to affect lives long after the Belgian colonizers left. The cold open thus sets the tone for the entire documentary, establishing not only the historical facts but also the emotional core of the story. It creates a sense of lingering sorrow, a deep awareness that the suffering inflicted during Belgium's colonial rule in the Congo remains unhealed. The coldness of the Belgian rulers and their heartless policies of separating families is brought to life in vivid, personal detail, leaving the audience with a feeling of dread, unease, and curiosity. The question remains, how could this atrocity have happened? And, more chillingly, how could it have been allowed to continue for so long? In the late 1800s, the world was witnessing an explosion of imperial power. Across the globe, European powers were carving up continents, seeking dominion over vast and fertile lands. Among these powers, King Leopold II of Belgium stood out for his personal claim over a vast swath of land, an area more than 70 times the size of Belgium itself. It was the Congo Free State, a region in Central Africa that was portrayed to the outside world as a place in desperate need of civilization and modernization. What was hidden beneath the veneer of this humanitarian rhetoric, however, was an exploitation so severe that it would leave an indelible mark on the region for generations to come. It is here, amidst the violence, fear, and unimaginable cruelty, that the story of abductions, forced labor, and stolen children takes root. The Congo, before Leopold's arrival, was a region rich in natural resources, its landscape dominated by dense rainforests, mighty rivers, and sprawling savannas. The Congolese people had lived in these lands for centuries, developing their own systems of governance, culture, and trade. However, to the outside world, the Congo was seen as a dark, untamed wilderness. European explorers, motivated by adventure, trade, and imperialism, had begun to venture into the interior in the mid-19th century. At first, their presence was limited to a few expeditions and missionaries who reported on the backward state of the inhabitants, painting them as savages in need of European intervention. But it wasn't until King Leopold II, through cunning diplomacy and manipulation, claimed control of the Congo that the true horrors would begin. Leopold's acquisition of the Congo was a masterstroke of imperial deception. Using the guise of a humanitarian mission, he presented himself to the international community as a benevolent ruler who sought to improve the lives of the indigenous people through education, infrastructure, and commerce. Leopold was careful to portray his venture as one of peace and progress. In 1885, the Berlin Conference had formalized the division of Africa among European powers, and Leopold managed to convince the other European nations that he was there to civilize the region. With the international community's blessing, Leopold declared the Congo his personal property, an imperialistic move that would come to haunt the land for decades. However, what he was really after was the enormous wealth to be gained from the region's resources, particularly rubber, ivory, and minerals. From the moment he took control, Leopold turned the Congo into his private fiefdom. What had been presented as an effort to bring civilization to the Congolese people was in fact a brutal, heartless system of exploitation that resulted in one of the most violent chapters in colonial history. The country's indigenous population, numbering in the millions, was forced into grueling labor under the threat of violence and death. Entire villages were subjugated, their leaders either co-opted or exterminated. The brutality of Leopold's rule was relentless, but it was not until the rubber boom of the early 20th century that the true horrors of the system began to emerge. The rubber trade was at the heart of Leopold's extraction economy, and it was here that the exploitation reached its most extreme. Rubber, harvested from the vines of the rubber tree, was in high demand by the burgeoning industries of Europe. The demand for rubber skyrocketed during the Industrial Revolution, and Leopold, seeing an opportunity to amass unimaginable wealth, sought to control its production in the Congo. The workforce to harvest the rubber, however, was not voluntary. Instead, Leopold's regime enacted a policy of forced labor that left the indigenous population vulnerable to every manner of abuse. The Congolese were required to meet impossible quotas for rubber collection, and those who failed to meet the demands faced brutal punishments. Entire villages were threatened with destruction, their homes burned to the ground, their people subjected to horrific violence. For men, the threat of mutilation was ever present. The infamous hand quota became a symbol of this cruelty. If a worker failed to meet his rubber collection quota, his hand was severed as punishment. This practice became a chilling reminder of Leopold's complete disregard for human life. But the horrors didn't stop there. Women and children were frequently taken hostage to ensure compliance, and entire families were held accountable for the actions of individual workers. The Belgian officials, military officers, and mercenaries who oversaw this system of forced labor were brutal in their enforcement, using whips, guns, and even decapitations to keep the indigenous population in line. As the rubber trade expanded, so did the need for a greater workforce, and the Belgian authorities turned to increasingly extreme measures to maintain control. It was during this period that the most unspeakable acts were committed, the abduction of women and children. The Belgian officials understood that in order to maximize their profits, they needed to break the spirit of the people entirely. The abduction of children, in particular, became a method of ensuring that entire communities would remain compliant. Families who failed to meet their rubber quotas were given an impossible choice: either comply, or watch their children be taken away. This became a widespread policy, one that devastated the social fabric of the Congo. Parents were forced to make unimaginable decisions, often sacrificing their children in a desperate attempt to preserve the lives of the rest of their families. The psychological toll of this policy was profound. The abduction of children not only fractured families, but it destroyed entire communities. Villages became desolate and hollowed out, as fear and suspicion took root. The idea of a safe home, a place where children could grow up surrounded by the love of their parents, was completely shattered. For the women of the Congo, the loss of their children was not just an emotional trauma, it was a deep, existential wound that left lasting scars on the soul of the community. The women, who had once been the cornerstone of their families, found themselves powerless to protect their most vulnerable loved ones. The men, too, were left broken, their spirits crushed under the weight of the Belgian authorities' cruelty. It was a system designed to humiliate and break the very core of the Congolese people. Amidst this terror, a paradox emerged: Belgium, through its official propaganda and diplomatic efforts, managed to convince much of the world that it was doing noble work in the Congo. The propaganda machine, with its carefully curated images of European missionaries bringing education and enlightenment to the dark heart of Africa, ensured that most of the international community remained ignorant or indifferent to the horrors taking place. The atrocities were not reported on by the global press, and Belgium's economic interests in the Congo continued to be supported by major European powers, who saw the colony as a valuable asset in the race for imperial dominance. But beneath this carefully constructed image of benevolence, the reality for the Congolese people was far darker. The world remained blind to the violence, exploitation, and systematic abuse that the Belgian regime inflicted on the people of the Congo. While the rubber trade enriched Belgium, it impoverished and destroyed the lives of millions of Africans. As the Belgian authorities continued to strip the land of its resources, the Congolese were left with nothing but their suffering, their broken families, and their unanswered cries. In this bleak and forgotten era, the stories of those who endured the brutalities of Leopold's regime remained largely untold. The history of the Congo Free State was hidden beneath layers of colonial propaganda and political indifference. For many years, the true extent of the atrocities would remain obscured, and it would take decades before the world began to wake up to the horrors that had been perpetrated in the name of profit. But even as the story of the Congo began to emerge, the legacy of pain, trauma, and loss endured, continuing to haunt the descendants of those who lived through one of the most brutal regimes the world has ever known. In the early days of Belgian rule over the Congo Free State, the signs of horror were subtle, whispered through the wind and across the dense forested regions where communities lived in relative isolation. Yet, as the rubber trade began to intensify, so too did the unsettling rumors. At first, the horror was not a clear picture, but more of an eerie, unspoken presence that seemed to hang in the air, something just out of view, like a shadow lurking behind the trees. The first reports were jarring but difficult to substantiate, dismissed by those in power as exaggerations or the fantastical fabrications of the indigenous population. Still, those who listened closely and paid attention to the smallest details could sense that something far more sinister was taking place in the depths of the Congo. The initial signs of violence were most apparent in the villages and towns where the rubber collection was taking place. Men, women, and children were subjected to the brutal demands of the Belgian overseers, who worked tirelessly to meet the quotas set by Leopold's regime. As the rubber trade gained momentum, it became clear that the Congolese people were being treated as little more than disposable laborers. The Belgian officers and soldiers, tasked with maintaining control, were often reported to have carried out their duties with a cruel indifference to human suffering. Yet it was not just the direct violence that marked the beginning of the horror, it was the creeping, insidious fear that began to seep into every aspect of daily life. Families would wake up to find their children missing in the night. The small, tight-knit communities, where generations of families had lived together, were suddenly fractured by the very people they had once trusted. The Belgian soldiers would enter these villages, rounding up the women and children, sometimes taking the men as well, but more often than not, the children were the prime targets. They were taken as hostages, a means to ensure that their families complied with the impossible rubber quotas. The victims, often no older than 5 or 6, were torn from their mothers' arms without warning, their cries of confusion and terror echoing through the villages. The mothers, helpless and broken, could do little but watch as their children were dragged away, often never to be seen again. At this point, the atrocities were still something that many outside the Congo either did not fully understand or chose not to acknowledge. The Belgian officials attempted to conceal the scale of the suffering. What the international community did see, however, were carefully curated reports from missionaries who were embedded in the Congo, often painting a picture of European benevolence. They described the Belgian rule as being civilizing, in line with the supposed moral duty of Europeans to uplift the African people. To the outside world, it appeared that Belgium was offering education, hospitals, and roads, providing what they believed were essential structures for development. But behind this false narrative, something far more insidious was at work. In the villages, the first whispers of resistance began to spread, though these whispers were filled with an undercurrent of dread. Word of the abductions and the horrors they brought with them was slowly leaking out. Early witnesses, missionaries, traders, and sometimes even Belgian officers themselves, began to speak of the atrocities they had witnessed. But their reports were few and far between, often dismissed by the authorities who had more to gain from maintaining the facade of a civilizing mission. At best, they were ignored; at worst, the whistleblowers were silenced, either through intimidation or outright violence. The first real attempts to address the abuses came from those on the periphery of the colonial system, those who were neither fully complicit nor totally powerless. African leaders who had heard the rumors tried to organize and resist, but their efforts were fragmented and met with overwhelming force. The resistance, though born from a sense of deep injustice, faced an insurmountable challenge. The Belgian military was vast, powerful, and ruthless. It was not merely soldiers who enforced the will of the colonial government but also a vast network of mercenaries, local collaborators, and armed agents of the colonial state. The force publique, a militia made up of both Belgian soldiers and African conscripts, was used as an instrument of terror. Armed with rifles and, at times, machetes, they enforced the rule of the Belgian authorities with ruthless efficiency. When African leaders began to organize, they were quickly quashed by overwhelming force, their villages razed, and their families subjected to even greater punishment. The Congo was no longer a place where simple communities could live in peace, it had become a battleground of psychological warfare, where fear and terror ruled every corner. Men, women, and children lived under constant surveillance, unsure of when the next wave of abductions would come. Families that were once thriving in their traditions were suddenly forced into a state of perpetual anxiety, unable to trust even their closest neighbors. Those who were fortunate enough to avoid direct violence often found themselves in a state of quiet despair. It was not just the physical trauma that affected them, it was the psychological toll of living in a place where life could be taken without reason, where your children could disappear in the middle of the night, and there was no one to turn to for help. One of the most chilling aspects of the early signs of horror was the sheer normalcy with which these acts of violence were carried out. The local Belgian authorities never questioned the system they had established, it was simply the way things were. The violence, the abductions, and the suffering were seen as natural consequences of the rubber trade, and the Belgian government worked tirelessly to suppress any reports that might tarnish their image abroad. The world, at least for the time being, remained largely unaware of the extent of the brutality. In the few instances where stories of the Congo's horrors did leak out, they were often dismissed or written off as exaggerated accounts, because after all, how could such things be happening in a colony that was supposedly improving the lives of the locals? As more and more families were torn apart, the early signs of horror became harder to ignore. Eyewitness accounts from surviving families and travelers began to reach the outside world, although these were often met with skepticism or outright disbelief. The stories spoke of women who had watched their children be taken, men who had been forced into hard labor, and communities that had been shattered by the Belgian regime's tactics. What had begun as isolated incidents of violence now appeared to be part of a larger, more coordinated system of oppression. The tragedy of the abductions was not just about the individual families who suffered but about a systematic, cold-blooded effort to control the very essence of life in the Congo. The Belgian authorities were quick to dismiss the reports, branding them as lies or exaggerations. But the increasing frequency of these stories left a trail of suspicion that could no longer be ignored. It was becoming clear that the Belgian occupation of the Congo was not the benevolent mission they had promised the world, it was something far darker, far more horrifying. Yet, for many years, the first signs of this horror were met with silence, and those who dared to speak out found themselves ignored, dismissed, or silenced in far more sinister ways. The atrocities, buried beneath layers of colonial propaganda and systemic denial, would take decades to be fully recognized, and the horror that had been unfolding in the heart of Africa would remain, for too long, a hidden tragedy. Plan unfolds. King Leopold II's plans for the Congo were not born out of charity or a desire to civilize the African people, as the Belgian government would later claim. Instead, they were rooted in a cold, calculated vision of personal enrichment and imperial dominance. The brutal exploitation of the Congo was always intended to be a means to an end, a means to acquire untold wealth through the extraction of rubber, ivory, and minerals. The world, meanwhile, saw a different image. Leopold portrayed himself as a benevolent ruler, a king on a mission to bring order, infrastructure, and education to a dark land. Behind the curtains, however, was a brutal regime built on forced labor, human cruelty, and the complete disregard for African lives. As the rubber trade expanded, the true nature of Belgian rule began to emerge in the darkest corners of the Congo. The forced labor system became the cornerstone of Leopold's strategy. Congolese men, women, and children were compelled to harvest rubber, often under threats of violence. This created a system where entire families were enslaved for the benefit of the Belgian state, forced into labor in grueling conditions. The Belgian authorities had one simple goal: to increase rubber production, at any cost. This would be achieved not through the cooperation of the local population but through their subjugation. The authorities soon realized that in order to extract the maximum amount of rubber, they would need to force the local populations into submission, particularly through the threat of violence against their most vulnerable members, their children. The first major step in this plan was the institution of the hand quota, a terrifying system designed to ensure that the Congolese would meet rubber collection demands. The hand quota was a system where, for every unit of rubber that was not harvested, the workers would be punished. Failure to meet these quotas was punished through horrific acts of violence. The most infamous of these punishments involved the severing of hands. Soldiers would go from village to village, collecting rubber, and if a worker or a village failed to meet the imposed quotas, they were forced to provide a hand as proof of compliance. These hands were often severed from living bodies, and the severed hands were counted as trophies, presented as evidence of the authorities' unflinching control over the native population. However, the taking of hands was not the only form of punishment used. The Belgian authorities began to systematically target children, using them as hostages to ensure the compliance of entire communities. The Congolese were faced with an agonizing choice: either meet the impossible rubber quotas or watch as their children were taken away by the soldiers. The soldiers would march into villages, often with little to no warning, and take children, sometimes babies, sometimes older children, and march them off into the unknown, never to return. These children were held hostage, used as leverage against the families who could not meet the rubber quotas. The authorities understood that the threat of violence against children would break the spirit of the parents, forcing them to work even harder, driven by the desperate hope that their children might be returned if they complied. What followed was a systematic campaign to destroy the very concept of family in the Congo. The Belgian rulers sought not only to extract rubber but to break the fundamental social fabric that held Congolese society together. The destruction of families was a tactic used to crush resistance and ensure that the people remained compliant. The authorities would often separate children from their parents, causing a psychological rift that would tear apart entire communities. The emotional devastation caused by the loss of a child to the Belgian regime was immense. These children were taken away to be used as pawns in a game of colonial control, their futures irrevocably altered. It was a policy rooted in terror and domination. As the demand for rubber grew, so did the violence and fear. The local populations had no means of resisting the overpowering force of the Belgian military, which was armed with modern weapons and backed by the full might of the colonial administration. The Force Publique, a paramilitary force made up of both Belgian officers and African conscripts, was responsible for carrying out the brutal policies of Leopold's regime. The soldiers were tasked with keeping the Congolese people in check, ensuring that they met the rubber quotas, and punishing any resistance with swift and ruthless force. The Force Publique's actions were often marked by random acts of violence, including massacres, rapes, and executions. Their control over the population was maintained through a climate of fear that permeated every aspect of life in the Congo. The Belgian rulers, however, were careful to present their actions in the most positive light possible. The official narrative, constructed and disseminated by Leopold's government, painted a picture of a benevolent colonial administration that was working to bring civilization to the Congo. Missionaries were enlisted to help spread this narrative, offering a vision of Christian salvation through the teachings of European values. European journalists and travelers were also encouraged to write favorable reports on the Belgian efforts in Africa, often being shown carefully curated scenes of progress, schools, hospitals, and roads being built. These images, however, were a far cry from the reality of the situation on the ground. The true nature of Belgian colonialism was hidden behind layers of carefully constructed propaganda. The atrocities, though, could not remain hidden forever. As the suffering in the Congo deepened, reports began to surface in Europe, though they were initially ignored or dismissed. Missionaries and foreign traders who had witnessed the horrors began to speak out, but their voices were often drowned out by the powerful Belgian state, which had no intention of allowing its profitable enterprise to be interrupted by a few inconvenient truths. However, as more and more witnesses came forward, the evidence of the atrocities could no longer be ignored. One of the first to bring the plight of the Congolese to the attention of the world was a British journalist named Edmond de Morel. In the late 1890s, Morel, who had worked as a shipping clerk in Antwerp, began to notice discrepancies in the Belgian trade practices with the Congo. He realized that the vast quantities of rubber and ivory being sent from the Congo were being exchanged for weapons and ammunition, which were then used to further brutalize the local population. Morel's investigations, combined with reports from missionaries, traders, and travelers, led him to expose the brutal exploitation and violence in the Congo. His efforts were instrumental in launching a campaign that eventually brought international attention to the Congo Free State's atrocities. Morel's reporting led to public outcry in Europe, and pressure mounted on the Belgian government to take action. But despite the growing outcry, the Belgian rulers, under Leopold's command, fought hard to protect their interests. Leopold, who had portrayed himself as a philanthropist and protector of the Congo's indigenous people, was quick to defend his actions and the actions of his officials. The Belgian government, though it eventually took control of the Congo in 1908 after mounting international pressure, did so reluctantly. Leopold's personal wealth from the rubber trade had made him one of the richest men in the world, and he was determined to keep the Congo's resources under his control for as long as possible. Even after the Congo Free State was handed over to the Belgian government, the legacy of Leopold's reign endured. The extraction of wealth from the Congo continued, though with somewhat less brutality, as the Belgian colonial administration assumed control. The damage to the people, however, was done. The policies of abduction, forced labor, and family separation had left deep scars on the Congolese population. The brutality of the Belgian regime in the Congo would go down in history as one of the most horrific examples of imperial exploitation, and the children who had been stolen, torn from their families, became tragic symbols of a colonial atrocity that was too long ignored. As the horrors of Belgian rule continued to unfold in the Congo, a deep undercurrent of resentment began to rise among the local population. What started as whispers in the villages, quiet murmurs of resistance, gradually swelled into a more organized, though still fragmented, opposition against the colonial regime. It was a slow, desperate process, driven by the overwhelming need to reclaim a sense of dignity, a sense of control over their own lives. The brutality of the Belgian authorities, who had torn apart families, mutilated bodies, and inflicted unimaginable suffering, became the catalyst for the rise of the first signs of organized defiance. The Congolese people, however, were up against an enemy far more powerful, a colonial machine with immense military might, armed with modern weapons, and backed by a system that was indifferent to human life. The initial resistance efforts were not grand uprisings but small acts of defiance that occurred across the Congo. Families began to hide their children, keeping them out of sight whenever Belgian soldiers came to collect their quotas of rubber. Village leaders began to encourage the people to stop working for the Belgian authorities, to refuse the demands of the overseers who came to extract their labor at gunpoint. There were quiet moments of rebellion, hidden beneath the surface of daily life, a village refusing to produce its allotted amount of rubber, a community deciding to remain silent when Belgian officials came to ask for workers. These were subtle forms of resistance, the beginnings of a larger movement that would, over time, grow more vocal and more dangerous. However, this early resistance was not without its risks. The Belgian military, led by the ruthless force public, was swift in punishing any signs of defiance. Villages that failed to meet their quotas were often met with brutal retribution, whole communities were razed to the ground, crops were destroyed, and the people were subjected to terrifying violence. In the most extreme cases, entire villages were wiped out, the men, women, and children slaughtered in cold blood as a message to others who might consider challenging the Belgian authorities. Those who tried to resist were quickly crushed by the overwhelming might of the colonial forces, making it clear that rebellion would not be tolerated. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, the whispers of resistance continued to spread. They became more frequent, more determined, and ultimately, they began to inspire others to stand up against their oppressors. As the Belgian officials continued to tighten their grip on the Congo, resistance movements began to take on a more organized form. Village leaders and tribal chiefs, many of whom had previously attempted to negotiate or cooperate with the Belgian authorities, began to speak out against the injustices that were being inflicted upon their people. These leaders, once allies of the colonial regime, found it increasingly difficult to ignore the mounting evidence of the atrocities taking place. Some of them, realizing the full extent of what was happening, turned against the Belgians, choosing instead to rally their people in defiance. One of the most powerful symbols of resistance during this period came from the women of the Congo. The women, who had borne the brunt of the violence and exploitation, became central figures in the resistance movement. They were the ones who had seen their children stolen, their husbands beaten, and their homes destroyed. Many women, knowing that their children were being used as pawns in the Belgian system, began to take direct action. Some took to hiding their children, smuggling them out of the villages to relatives who lived in the more remote areas of the Congo, out of reach of the Belgian soldiers. Others began to speak out publicly, defying the authorities in open protests. These small acts of rebellion, though they were quickly punished by the Belgian military, became the foundation for a growing sense of defiance that would eventually spread to more areas of the Congo. As the resistance grew, so too did the fear among the Belgian authorities. The Belgian officials had long believed that their hold on the Congo was unshakable, that their military and economic power could suppress any form of rebellion. Yet, as the resistance continued to spread, the Belgians found themselves unable to fully control the population. This increasing resistance, although still in its infancy, began to take its toll on the colonial administration, which found itself stretched thin trying to maintain order in the face of growing unrest. The Belgian authorities responded by intensifying their efforts to suppress the rebellion. The force publique, which had already been notorious for its cruelty, was given even more power to quash any signs of dissent. Military campaigns were launched against villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters, and whole regions were subjected to brutal pacification tactics, where the indigenous population was forcibly removed, their homes burned to the ground. In addition to the military crackdown, the Belgian government sought to discredit the resistance by branding its leaders as rebels or terrorists, painting them as enemies of progress and civilization. Belgian propaganda painted a picture of a peaceful and benevolent colonial project, and any opposition to it was depicted as an irrational, violent response to the generosity of the Belgian administration. Yet, despite the efforts to silence the resistance, the movement continued to grow, fueled by the collective pain and suffering of the Congolese people. In the face of such overwhelming power, many of the early resistance efforts were not enough to turn the tide of colonial rule. The Belgians, with their superior military and economic resources, were able to maintain control of much of the Congo, despite the mounting unrest. However, the actions of these early resistors set the stage for later uprisings and movements that would eventually bring the brutal colonial system into the international spotlight. But the early resistance was not just about opposing the Belgian authorities, it was also about survival. For the Congolese people, every act of defiance was an act of survival. It was a way of holding on to their humanity in the face of a system that sought to strip them of it. The people of the Congo, especially the women and children who had borne the brunt of the colonial policies, were determined to fight back, to hold on to what was left of their families, their culture, and their very existence. It was a slow, grueling battle, and for many, it seemed as though there was no hope of victory. Yet the resistance continued, powered by a fierce will to survive and a deep sense of injustice. As whispers of resistance spread, the legacy of these early acts of defiance began to take root in the Congo. Over time, these small pockets of rebellion grew into larger, more coordinated movements, as more people began to understand that the atrocities they had suffered were not just isolated incidents but part of a larger system of oppression that needed to be confronted. The Belgian authorities, as they had done before, sought to crush the resistance with violence, but they found themselves facing an increasingly determined and united opposition. The fight for freedom in the Congo was not just about resisting the Belgian authorities, it was about reclaiming the Congo's identity, its people, and its future. As the resistance gained momentum, so did the international awareness of the atrocities being committed in the Congo. Reports from missionaries, traders, and journalists began to leak out of the region, exposing the horrors of the Belgian system. These reports, combined with the defiant actions of the Congolese people, helped to bring the Belgian regime's atrocities to the attention of the wider world. Yet, even as the international community began to take notice, the resistance continued to face overwhelming odds, struggling to survive in a world that seemed determined to forget their suffering. In the end, the early resistance in the Congo laid the foundation for a larger struggle that would continue for decades. It was a fight not just for freedom from colonial rule but for the very soul of the Congolese people. The whispers of resistance that began in the villages of the Congo eventually grew into a powerful movement that would change the course of history. But for those who lived through the early days of defiance, the battle was not just political, it was deeply personal, a fight for their families, their children, and their future. As the abuses in the Congo Free State grew ever more horrific, a strange silence descended over the international community. The world seemed to be content with the comforting narrative presented by King Leopold II and his Belgian government, which depicted their actions as benevolent and civilizing. This narrative was carefully constructed to hide the true nature of what was occurring in the Congo, where millions of lives were being systematically destroyed. Despite the mounting evidence of atrocities, reports of mutilations, kidnappings, and forced labor were either ignored or dismissed by the global powers that benefited from the exploitation of the Congo's resources. Public denial became a powerful tool of the Belgian authorities, and the silence of the world would remain a haunting feature of the Congo's colonial experience for many years. The first line of defense for Belgium was, of course, their own government. King Leopold, in particular, was highly protective of his empire and was determined to ensure that the lucrative rubber trade in the Congo continued without interference. The narrative presented to the world was one of humanitarian mission and the supposed noble work being done to civilize the Congolese people. The Belgian government insisted that the colony was improving under their rule, with roads being built, schools being established, and a supposed rise in economic development. These stories, which painted a picture of progress, were skillfully disseminated through the press, and many of the world's major powers turned a blind eye to the darker side of the colonial venture. King Leopold's careful management of public relations was key in maintaining this illusion. He established a network of influential figures, including academics, missionaries, and journalists, who would lend their voices to the cause of supporting Belgian rule in the Congo. These individuals, often well respected in their fields, wrote glowing reports that emphasized the good work being done in the Congo. They described Belgium as bringing modernity to a savage land, teaching the indigenous population agriculture, education, and religion. These reports, often based on limited or skewed observations, helped to reinforce the narrative of a benevolent colonizer who was improving the lives of the Congolese people. With such propaganda being spread across Europe, it was easy for the atrocities to remain hidden from the general public. In addition to the manipulation of the media, Leopold's regime also sought to discredit any voices that threatened to expose the truth. This tactic was particularly effective when it came to the missionaries and foreign traders who had witnessed the atrocities firsthand. While some missionaries attempted to report the widespread abuse they saw, their voices were often marginalized. The Belgian government worked quickly to silence or discredit those who spoke out, branding them as alarmists or exaggerators. The few individuals who dared to challenge the narrative were subjected to harassment, and some were even forced to leave the Congo under duress. One such voice that would eventually break through the wall of silence was that of the British journalist Edmund Dean Morel. Morel, who worked as a shipping clerk for a Belgian trading company, began to notice the vast quantities of rubber and ivory being exported from the Congo, exchanged for weapons and ammunition. He became suspicious of the Belgian motives, and through his research, he uncovered the horrifying reality of the forced labor system that had been put in place in the Congo. Morel was one of the first to link the brutality of the rubber trade with the Belgian government's policies and to make the connection between the supply of weapons and the violence that was being perpetrated against the indigenous population. Yet even as Morel began to expose the truth, his reports were met with resistance and indifference from the wider world. Leopold's influence in European circles was such that even those who might have been sympathetic to the suffering in the Congo found themselves hesitant to speak out. The Belgian monarchy had long been an important player in European politics, and many European governments, particularly in Britain and France, had economic interests tied to the colonial venture in Africa. The rubber trade was not just a Belgian issue, it was a global one, with European industries benefiting from the exploitation of the Congo's resources. This created a complex web of complicity, where silence became the default position for many who were aware of the atrocities but saw little reason to challenge a system that profited them. The political and economic factors that contributed to the silence were compounded by a general lack of awareness in the public. The average European citizen, especially in Britain and Belgium, was largely uninformed about the true nature of Belgian colonial rule in the Congo. Colonialism, at this point in history, was still widely accepted as a legitimate enterprise, and many people were more focused on the benefits that their nations were receiving from imperial ventures than on the suffering of those under colonial rule. The Belgian monarchy's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to maintain the illusion of progress, and as a result, it took years for the full extent of the atrocities to come to light. The Belgian government's control over information was so strong that even in the Congo itself, the people were kept in the dark about the outside world's growing awareness of their plight. The Congolese were entirely dependent on the Belgian authorities for information, and any attempt to disseminate alternate narratives was immediately quashed. The regime's power extended not just over the physical lives of the Congolese but also over their access to knowledge, ensuring that they remained isolated and unaware of the international efforts to expose the horrors they were living through. As the years went on, a small but determined group of individuals continued to fight to bring the truth to light. Despite the efforts to suppress dissent, voices like Morel's gained traction. The growing awareness of the Congo's plight was bolstered by reports from missionaries and African rights organizations, which began to expose the brutality of the rubber trade. These efforts were not without their risks. Morel, for instance, faced considerable danger as he worked to build a public campaign against Leopold's rule. However, his efforts, combined with those of others, eventually brought the Congo's atrocities to the attention of the wider world. Morel's campaign led to the formation of the Congo Reform Association in 1904, which gained significant support from prominent figures such as Mark Twain and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Despite the mounting evidence and public outcry, the Belgian government continued to deny any wrongdoing. Leopold's regime refused to acknowledge the widespread abuse, and the Belgian monarchy continued to insist that their efforts in the Congo were in the best interest of the local population. The propaganda that had been spread for so many years was not easily undone, and the Belgian government attempted to discredit those who spoke out, claiming that they were exaggerating or outright lying about the situation. For much of the early 20th century, the Belgian authorities maintained a strong grip on the narrative, ensuring that the public remained largely ignorant of the true extent of the horrors in the Congo. It wasn't until international pressure grew to unbearable levels that Belgium was forced to act. In 1908, after years of sustained campaigning by individuals like Morel and other activists, the Belgian government officially took control of the Congo from King Leopold II, ending the brutal personal rule of the king. However, by this point, the damage had been done. The legacy of Leopold's reign, with its focus on exploitation, violence, and denial, left a permanent scar on the Congolese people. The system of forced labor, though modified, continued for years, and the psychological trauma of the abductions, the mutilations, and the family separations would haunt generations of Congolese for decades. Public denial had allowed the atrocities to continue unchecked for far too long. The silence of the world during this period was not just a failure of moral responsibility, it was a tragic reminder of how powerful systems of oppression can manipulate narratives to maintain control. Even as the cries of the Congolese people went unheard, the international community turned a blind eye to their suffering. It was only through the tireless efforts of a few brave individuals and groups that the truth was finally brought into the light, but by then, the damage was irrevocable. The legacy of denial, silence, and complicity would remain a dark chapter in both Belgian and world history for generations to come. The situation in the Congo under Belgian rule escalated into an unparalleled nightmare as the psychological toll on the indigenous population became more severe and pervasive. The brutality of the Belgian regime, which had once been somewhat localized, was now felt everywhere, across villages, towns, and even deep in the forests where the Congolese sought refuge. The forced labor system, the abduction of children, and the constant threat of violence shattered not only the bodies but also the minds of the people. What began as a policy of exploitation soon turned into a systematic attempt to break the will of the Congolese people, one that would have lasting effects on their mental and emotional states, their sense of identity, and their very survival. At the heart of this escalation was the Belgian military's unrelenting pressure on the Congolese population to meet impossible rubber quotas. The Congo, rich in natural resources, became a place where human life was seen as expendable, where the only measure of value was the amount of rubber extracted from the land. Families were torn apart, not just by the physical separation of mothers and fathers from their children but by the constant fear that anyone, at any moment, could be taken away or forced into the grueling labor system. The very act of living became a psychological burden, as the inhabitants of the Congo were always looking over their shoulders, waiting for the next brutal wave of oppression to strike. The abduction of children became one of the most psychologically damaging aspects of Belgian colonial rule. Children, who were the most vulnerable members of society, were taken from their families with no regard for the emotional and psychological trauma this would cause. The Belgian soldiers, tasked with enforcing the rubber quotas, would come into villages, often in the dead of night, and remove children from their homes. These children, sometimes as young as 5 or 6, were used as hostages to ensure the compliance of their families. The mere knowledge that a child could be taken at any moment planted a seed of perpetual fear in the minds of every parent in the Congo. The anguish of watching one's child being taken away without the slightest possibility of intervention destroyed the emotional stability of entire communities. The feeling of helplessness, of being unable to protect one's own flesh and blood, lingered long after the Belgian soldiers left. The trauma of child abductions had a ripple effect throughout Congolese society. It affected not just the parents whose children were taken but also the extended families and the broader community. The children who were taken were never returned, and the memory of their absence lingered in the minds of the elders who would recount stories of the lost children for generations. The grief was compounded by the lack of closure. There were no bodies to bury, no final goodbyes, no sense of peace. This absence created a collective psychological wound that festered for decades, a wound that could never truly heal. For the families left behind, the absence of a child was a constant reminder of the powerlessness they felt under Belgian rule. The effects of this psychological trauma extended far beyond the immediate pain of child abductions. The forced labor system, which saw men, women, and children working under unbearable conditions to meet rubber quotas, led to a breakdown in the social fabric of Congolese society. Communities that once functioned as close-knit units, where bonds of trust and cooperation were the foundations of daily life, were torn apart by the pressures of the colonial regime. The men who were forced to work in the rubber fields were often kept far from their homes, living in near slavery under the supervision of Belgian soldiers. They were subjected to constant violence, forced to work in dangerous conditions, and given little or no food or rest. The physical toll on their bodies was immense, but the emotional toll was just as devastating. The men were stripped of their dignity and autonomy, reduced to mere tools for the extraction of wealth, and forced to watch as their families were terrorized and displaced. Women, too, suffered deeply under the psychological strain of Belgian colonial rule. They were often left behind to fend for themselves and their families while the men were taken away to work in the rubber fields. The separation of families caused immense emotional distress, as mothers were left to care for their children alone, knowing that at any moment, their children could be taken as hostages. The constant fear of losing a child, of seeing a husband return broken or dead, placed an unrelenting burden on the women of the Congo. Many women became the primary caregivers, educators, and protectors in the absence of men, but they were also the ones who carried the emotional weight of the family's suffering. The psychological strain on these women was immense, as they bore witness to the collapse of their communities, the breakdown of their traditional way of life, and the brutal reality of living under a regime that saw them as nothing more than disposable laborers. For the youth, the psychological impact was equally profound. The loss of childhood innocence was replaced with a brutal survival instinct. Young children were forced into labor, sometimes working alongside their parents, picking rubber or carrying heavy loads. The constant exposure to violence and exploitation robbed them of any sense of safety or stability. The children who witnessed their siblings or friends being taken, killed, or mutilated by Belgian soldiers grew up with a deep sense of loss, trauma, and anger. Many young people, deprived of the chance to experience a normal childhood, grew up in a world of fear and brutality, where survival was the only priority. The psychological scars left by this environment would shape their lives for years to come, leaving an entire generation scarred by the trauma of Belgian colonialism. The impact of the Belgian regime on the psychological health of the Congolese people was profound, but it was also subtle in many ways. The trauma was not always visible in the form of physical injuries or obvious signs of mental illness, but it was deeply ingrained in the fabric of daily life. The fear of loss, the constant threat of violence, and the overwhelming sense of powerlessness affected the way the people of the Congo viewed the world and themselves. Many became numb to the suffering around them, as the daily brutality of colonial rule became an unchangeable part of their reality. The psychological toll was not just a matter of individual suffering, it became a collective experience, passed down through generations. As the years of exploitation wore on, the psychological effects began to manifest in more destructive ways. The constant exposure to violence, loss, and hopelessness led to a breakdown in social structures. Traditional systems of governance and leadership, which had once provided the Congolese people with a sense of order and purpose, were undermined by the forces of colonial oppression. Tribal leaders were often targeted by the Belgian authorities, who saw them as potential threats to their rule. These leaders, once respected figures in their communities, were often co-opted by the colonial system, forced to collaborate with the Belgians in exchange for limited power and protection. This led to a further erosion of trust within Congolese society, as communities became fractured and divided. The sense of disempowerment and fear also led to a deep internalization of colonial ideals. Some members of the population, especially those who had been more directly exposed to European influences, began to believe that they were inferior to their colonizers. The constant barrage of propaganda from the Belgian authorities, which depicted Europeans as superior and civilized while portraying Africans as primitive and backward, took its toll. Over time, many Congolese began to internalize these ideas, leading to a sense of shame and self-loathing. This psychological effect was perhaps one of the most insidious aspects of colonial rule, the way in which it warped the self-perception of an entire people, leaving them with a sense of powerlessness and inferiority that would persist long after Belgian rule ended. The escalation of the Belgian regime's brutality in the Congo was not just about physical violence, it was also about the psychological toll it exacted on the population. The trauma of loss, fear, and exploitation became deeply embedded in the collective consciousness of the Congolese people, shaping their lives for generations. The scars left by Belgian colonialism were not just physical but emotional and psychological, creating a legacy of suffering that would take decades to begin to heal. As the brutal realities of Belgian rule in the Congo began to seep into international consciousness, the intellectual and academic world sought explanations for the atrocities that were unfolding. Many in Europe tried to frame the violence in terms of scientific and psychological theories, often driven by racial ideologies, that could make sense of what was happening. The Belgian government, for its part, encouraged such explanations, hoping to deflect criticism and justify its actions. Theories about the nature of the Congolese people, the supposed civilizing mission of the Belgian state, and the intellectual constructions of race were used as tools to mask the reality of exploitation and brutality. In Europe, colonialism was often framed through the lens of scientific racism, a pseudoscientific theory that categorized people into distinct races and claimed that some races were inherently superior to others. This theory had gained prominence in the 19th and early 20th centuries, with anthropologists, psychologists, and biologists supporting the idea that European civilization was the pinnacle of human achievement, while African societies were seen as primitive, backward, and in need of European intervention. These ideas were deeply entrenched in European thought and were used to rationalize the subjugation of non-European peoples. The Belgian administration in the Congo took advantage of this scientific framework to justify their actions. They claimed that their rule was not only beneficial but necessary to bring order to the chaotic and savage Congo, a land in desperate need of European guidance. According to Belgian propaganda, the brutality of the colonial system was not seen as exploitation but as a necessary and unfortunate consequence of the civilizing process. The horrific abuses, including the abduction of children and the forced labor system, were explained away by the Belgian authorities as an unfortunate but unavoidable part of the larger goal of bringing civilization and modernity to Africa. The Belgian government went to great lengths to portray itself as a benevolent force, rescuing the Congolese from their barbarism. The suffering of the people was minimized or ignored altogether, while the supposed benefits of Belgian rule, such as the construction of railways and schools, were emphasized. This distorted narrative was supported by many European intellectuals, who framed the violence and exploitation as part of a larger, noble endeavor. Some European academics and colonial officials posited that the Congolese were incapable of self-rule and that the brutal policies in the Congo were designed to teach the natives the value of hard work and discipline. Such explanations were rooted in deeply racist ideas that considered the Congolese, and Africans in general, as inferior beings who needed European oversight to avoid chaos. These views were often presented as scientific facts, bolstered by research that ignored or downplayed the atrocities occurring on the ground. While these ideas were promoted by those in power, they were not universally accepted. Some intellectuals and writers began to push back against the dominant narrative, questioning the moral and ethical implications of colonialism. As reports from missionaries and independent observers began to surface, challenging the government's carefully curated image of the Congo, the scientific theories that supported colonialism came under greater scrutiny. Missionaries, in particular, who had worked on the ground in the Congo, provided first-hand accounts of the violence and exploitation they witnessed. They offered a much darker, more nuanced view of colonialism, which contrasted sharply with the sanitized version of events promoted by the Belgian government. These accounts, however, were often dismissed by those in power as the exaggerated stories of sentimental or misguided individuals. One of the key figures in challenging the accepted narrative of the Congo was the aforementioned Edmond Dean Morel. Morel's work, which exposed the connection between the rubber trade and the military violence in the Congo, served as a direct counterpoint to the claims of benevolent rule put forward by the Belgian authorities. Through his meticulous investigations, Morel showed that the extraction of rubber and ivory from the Congo was facilitated by the supply of arms and ammunition, which were then used to maintain control over the indigenous population. His work was instrumental in bringing the atrocities to light, but it also forced the intellectual world to confront the flawed theories that underpinned European colonialism. Morel's investigations exposed the hypocrisy of the so-called civilizing mission, highlighting the deep contradictions between European ideals of progress and the horrific reality of imperial exploitation. In addition to Morel's investigative work, the psychological impact of colonialism on the Congolese people became a point of interest for a growing number of psychologists and social scientists. While some of these thinkers sought to understand the damage done to the individual psyche under colonial rule, others tried to frame the psychological destruction as a consequence of African inferiority. These conflicting views revealed the deep tensions within the intellectual world concerning the ethics of colonialism and the treatment of the Congolese people. Some psychologists, particularly those sympathetic to the plight of the Congolese, began to apply the emerging field of trauma psychology to the study of colonial abuse. They explored the long-term effects of living under a system of forced labor, violence, and dehumanization. The trauma caused by family separations, forced labor, and the constant threat of violence was profound. Psychologists began to recognize that the psychological damage of colonialism was not just individual but collective. Communities were shattered, and people lived in a constant state of fear and anxiety, knowing that at any moment, they could lose their loved ones, their land, or their lives. This collective trauma, passed down through generations, would have a lasting impact on the Congolese population, even after the end of colonial rule. Other intellectuals, however, took a more conservative view. They argued that the violence in the Congo was the result of primitive behaviors, inherent in the indigenous population, which required strict European control to be kept in check. These thinkers believed that the Congolese needed to be disciplined, that their capacity for rational thought and organization was limited by their race. These ideas were rooted in long-standing racist theories that had justified colonialism for centuries. While these views were not universally accepted, they had a significant influence on the colonial policies in the Congo, where the Belgian authorities continued to justify their violent tactics as necessary for maintaining order. The tension between these differing intellectual perspectives only intensified as the international community began to take notice of the situation in the Congo. As reports of the atrocities spread, the Belgian government and its intellectual supporters found themselves on the defensive. The more evidence came to light, the harder it became to defend the claim that Belgium was engaged in a noble civilizing mission. The scientific and psychological theories that had been used to justify the violence in the Congo began to crumble under scrutiny, revealing the deep moral and ethical contradictions at the heart of European colonialism. The collapse of these intellectual defenses marked a turning point in the way the world viewed the Belgian presence in the Congo. More and more people began to question the assumptions of racial superiority that had underpinned colonial rule. The atrocities in the Congo were no longer seen as a necessary evil but as an outright crime against humanity. Intellectuals, activists, and journalists from around the world began to demand accountability for the Belgian regime's actions, and the pressure from the international community ultimately led to the end of King Leopold's personal rule over the Congo in 1908. Despite the growing awareness of the atrocities, the psychological damage inflicted on the Congolese people would not easily fade. Theories that sought to explain away the violence, whether through scientific racism or psychological projection, failed to account for the resilience of the Congolese people, who fought to survive despite the overwhelming odds. But the intellectual debates that arose during this period helped to shed light on the true nature of colonial violence and its lasting impact on the psyche of those who lived under its yoke. The attempts to explain the brutality in the Congo ultimately revealed the deep moral failings of the colonial system and the profound harm it inflicted on the indigenous population. In the end, the scientific theories and psychological projections that had been used to justify the exploitation and abuse in the Congo failed to shield the Belgian regime from the growing outcry. As the world began to see the true face of colonialism, the intellectual defenses of Belgian rule crumbled, exposing the deep injustice at its core. The psychological and intellectual frameworks that had supported colonialism for so long could not withstand the weight of the truth, and the legacy of these failed justifications continues to haunt the Congo to this day. When King Leopold II officially ceded control of the Congo Free State to the Belgian government in 1908, marking the end of his personal reign over the colony, the world expected the atrocities that had plagued the region to cease. It was a moment of international triumph, where the pressure from activists, journalists, and human rights organizations succeeded in bringing an end to the reign of terror that had dominated the Congo for decades. Yet, what followed was not a simple resolution or healing process for the Congolese people. Instead, it marked the beginning of a complex, enduring silence that would stretch across the decades, a silence that would affect not only the survivors but also the international community and the way in which the atrocities of the past were remembered, or deliberately forgotten. The transition from Leopold's personal control to formal Belgian rule did not lead to the immediate relief or justice that many had hoped for. While the Belgian government officially took over the administration of the Congo, the system of exploitation that had been put in place under Leopold's regime did not disappear overnight. Though the rubber quotas were adjusted and the most egregious practices, such as the use of hostages to force labor, were officially outlawed, the Belgian administration continued to rule the Congo with the same imperialistic mindset. The forced labor system persisted, albeit under different guises, and the Congolese people continued to live under a system of racial subjugation that sought to maintain control through economic and physical oppression. In the years following the transfer of power, Belgium presented the end of Leopold's rule as a great humanitarian victory. The government went to great lengths to repair its image and distance itself from the crimes of the previous regime. Belgian officials, aided by their carefully managed propaganda apparatus, sought to portray the transition as an act of benevolence, where the noble Belgian state took over to help the Congolese people. However, these attempts to rewrite history were not fully embraced, and the voices of those who had lived through the horrors of Leopold's reign remained silenced in many ways. The true extent of the devastation caused by Belgian colonial rule, particularly under King Leopold's personal reign, was far too enormous to be adequately addressed in the immediate aftermath. While the Belgian government was formally accountable for the atrocities, it took little action to address the trauma or provide reparations to the Congolese population. Instead, Belgium continued to benefit from the immense wealth the Congo generated, and the remnants of the colonial system remained entrenched in the region's political and economic structures. Even though the violence against the Congolese people had officially ended, the effects of that violence reverberated throughout the population for generations. The survivors of Belgian colonialism were left to grapple with their trauma in relative isolation. The psychological wounds of the past, the deep emotional scars caused by the abduction of children, the mutilations, the forced labor, and the overwhelming fear that permeated every aspect of their daily lives, were never fully acknowledged or addressed by the Belgian authorities. The silence surrounding the suffering of the Congolese became a theme that would persist long after colonial rule officially ended. There was no formal truth commission to investigate the crimes committed under Leopold, no public reckoning for the horrors endured by the Congolese people. The Belgian government's failure to address the past created a void, one that would continue to haunt both the victims and the perpetrators for years to come. In the Congo itself, the silence was even more profound. The legacy of colonial rule had fractured Congolese society, leaving deep psychological and social wounds that could not easily be healed. Many survivors found it difficult to speak openly about their experiences. The trauma they had suffered was so immense that it became a kind of unspoken burden, passed down through generations. The fear of reprisal or the belief that nothing could change often kept people from talking about what had happened. Additionally, the widespread violence had created a culture of silence, where survivors were reluctant to relive the horrors of the past or to expose the extent of the damage caused by Belgian rule. For the younger generations growing up in the years following the end of Belgian rule, the lack of an open discourse about the past created a strange disconnection. Many Congolese, particularly in the early 20th century, had little understanding of the true nature of the Belgian regime's exploitation. The narrative taught to them in schools was shaped by the Belgian authorities, often glossing over the brutal history and presenting a version of events that minimized the suffering of the Congolese people. This educational gap left many without a clear understanding of the atrocities that had been committed in their name and against their ancestors.